The record was stamped closed. That was the first thing Counselor Vethsarn noticed when she pulled the file, not the contents, not the date, not the 700 pages of testimony compressed into a single archival node the size of her thumbnail. Just that stamp. Closed. In the administrative language of the Conclave of Seven, that word carried a specific legal weight. It meant the matter had been resolved. It meant no further review was warranted. It meant the species in question no longer existed as a recognized political entity in the galaxy. It did not mean they were gone. She had learned that distinction recently. Most of the council had not yet learned it at all. The file was 31 years old. The stamp had been applied in a single session lasting less than 4 hours, which struck her now as obscene. 4 hours to unmake a civilization, though she hadn't thought so at the time. At the time, she had voted with the majority. Everyone had. The sound that had drawn her back to the file was small. Almost nothing. A fragment of intercepted transmission, 6 seconds long, recovered from a relay buoy at the outer edge of the shattered expanse where no registered vessel had any business being. 6 seconds of static. And underneath the static, barely there, almost a ghost, a human voice singing. 31 years earlier, the vote had been unanimous. Not in the way votes were sometimes called unanimous through political convenience, where the dissenting voices simply declined to register their objections in the official record. This one was different. Every seated counselor from every member species had touched the approval node with their own biological signature. The record was clean. The reasoning was airtight. The legal mechanism was, and this phrase had been used 11 times in the supporting documentation, regrettably necessary. The humans had been given 14 chances. That was the number the Conclave's administrative apparatus had generated after processing 7 decades of contact history, treaty violations, military incidents, and cultural incompatibility assessments. 14 formal warnings. 14 opportunities to conform to the standards that every other spacefaring civilization had agreed to uphold as the baseline condition of galactic membership. 14 moments where a species capable of basic rational self-interest would have looked at the consequences arrayed against them and chosen differently. The humans had not chosen differently. They had, in fact, become progressively less cooperative with each warning, which the Conclave's Behavioral Analysis Division had flagged as statistically improbable, since in every other known case across 93 first contact histories, escalating external pressure produced predictable behavioral modulation. Species learned. Species adapted. Species weighed survival against pride and made the obvious calculation. "They're not failing to calculate," the Kethvori ambassador had said during the 3rd review session, 20 years into the contact period. "They're calculating correctly and still arriving at defiance, which means their internal values assign a weight to sovereignty that exceeds the weight they assign to survival." The chamber had gone quiet. "That's irrational," someone said. "Yes," the ambassador replied, "that's the problem." The banishment order had taken another 11 years to formalize, because the Conclave moved with geological slowness when the stakes were existential and nobody wanted to be first. But it had come, and when it came, it was thorough. Humanity's jumpgate access was revoked. Their trade corridors were sealed. The 12 colony worlds they had established in the outer reaches were surrounded by compliance blockades, not weapons, not yet, because the Conclave did not use weapons as a first instrument of policy, but by navigational denial fields that made it impossible for human vessels to chart a course beyond their own systems. The Sol system itself was flagged as a restricted zone. No member species was permitted to enter. No commerce, no communication, no contact. The message was simple: you are not part of this galaxy anymore. Exist quietly in your corner of it and we will not destroy you. Simply stop. Vethsarn remembered thinking, at the time, that it was generous. She had been younger then. She had not yet learned what humans did with corners. The 6 seconds of singing were not what brought her back to the file alone. It was the timestamp. She had run the signal through 3 separate authentication systems before accepting the result, because the result was impossible. The transmission had not been sent 31 years ago and left adrift in the expanse, slowly degrading in the cosmic background. It was fresh. The degradation markers placed its origin within the last 48 hours. Someone was out there, in the shattered expanse, which was technically outside the blockade perimeter because nobody had ever thought it necessary to blockade it. The expanse was unnavigable, a graveyard of failed colony ships and gravitational anomalies that had claimed 17 vessels across 4 species before a general advisory was posted warning all traffic away. Nobody went into the shattered expanse. The physics made it essentially suicidal. "Nobody we know," Vethsarn said to her assistant, who was a young Dravathi named Ulsen, fresh from the administrative academy and still possessed of the useful quality of not yet knowing which questions were impolite to ask. "Could it be a legacy probe?" Ulsen asked. "Something they launched before the banishment." "The signal is fresh. The source is moving." Ulsen processed this, moving, at approximately 40% of standard navigational threshold, which is not fast enough to be a weapon, not slow enough to be adrift, and precisely consistent with a vessel that has learned to travel through gravitationally unstable space by moving at the speed the instability allows rather than fighting it. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a mind encountered something it genuinely had not prepared a category for. "How long," Ulsen finally said, "would it take to learn to navigate the shattered expanse?" Vethsarn looked at the file, at the stamp that said closed, at the 31-year gap between then and now, which suddenly felt less like an absence and more like a preparation. "That," she said quietly, "is the first question I'm afraid to answer." There were 3 things she did not yet understand, and they formed a shape in her mind that she couldn't look at directly, only from the edges. The first, why the expanse? Of all the directions humanity could have pushed against the blockade, the shattered expanse was the most hostile, the most lethal, and the most obviously futile. There were gaps in the blockade's outer perimeter that a creative navigator might have exploited. There were trading relationships with non-member species that the Conclave had no legal authority to sever. There were a dozen more rational pressure points a species under isolation might have chosen to probe. They had gone into the killing ground instead. The second, the singing. In 6 seconds of transmission, the voice she'd heard was not sending a message. It wasn't a distress signal. It wasn't an encoded communication. It was someone singing to themselves, a human doing something humans apparently did when they were alone, in the dark, in the wreckage of a region of space that had killed 19 vessels and been abandoned by every rational species in the galaxy. Singing. The third. The file contained a footnote she had never read before, buried in an appendix that had been added to the record 8 years after the banishment. A surveillance report from a compliance drone that had made a single pass through the outer Sol system. Its findings had been flagged as asterisk inconclusive and archived without follow-up, because what it had detected did not match any recognized construction pattern, and the analysts had attributed it to sensor error. She read the footnote now. She read it twice. Then she opened a new channel and called the only person in the conclave she trusted to not immediately panic. "Vethsarn," said Counselor Draelmach of the Asavari, his image resolving in the dim blue light of her office. "It's the 4th hour. You look like something's wrong." "I think," she said carefully, "that we made a mistake 31 years ago." "We've made many mistakes. Which one is keeping you awake?" She sent him the file, the timestamp, the signal, the footnote. She watched his face as he read it. The Asavari were not an expressive species. Their features were mineral hard, their emotional responses slow and geological. But she saw the moment his composure shifted. It was small. A compression around the eye ridge, a stillness that was different from his normal stillness. The footnote says the drone detected evidence of underground construction, Draelmach said slowly, on 14 separate bodies in the outer system. Inconclusive, she quoted, attributed to sensor error. Because nobody builds underground on uninhabited system bodies, there's no reason to. Unless, Vethsarn said, you've been told you're not allowed to build anywhere you can be seen. Another silence, longer this time. How long have they been building? He asked. The drone pass was 8 years post-banishment, if the construction had already begun by then. 23 years minimum, he processed this. What does a species build underground for 23 years when they're not allowed to leave? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The question was its own answer, and both of them could feel the shape of it even if neither was ready to say it aloud. I need you to do something, she said instead, quietly, without routing it through the main administrative system. That's irregular. Yes. Vethsarn, his voice dropped lower. Are you suggesting we have reason to believe the Conclave's assessment of the human situation is currently inaccurate? I'm suggesting, she said, that the Conclave assessed humanity as a species that had been successfully contained, and I'm suggesting that the methodology for reaching that conclusion involved no direct observation of human activity for 23 years because we assumed the containment made such observation unnecessary. She paused. I want to know what we didn't look at. What they didn't look at had a name, though neither of them knew it yet. The humans called it the long patience. It had not started as a plan. That was the thing that the Conclave's analytical models would later struggle most desperately to process. The fact that it had emerged organically, from the bottom up, from millions of individual human decisions that had no central coordination body directing them toward a unified outcome. The Conclave understood hierarchical responses to existential pressure. It understood institutional survival mechanisms. It understood the mathematical logic of species-level strategic planning. What it did not have a model for was a civilization that had, collectively and without being told, decided to wait. Not passively, never passively. The distinction was one that would eventually become critical to understanding everything that followed. They had waited like a body waits when it knows it cannot win the immediate fight, by channeling every resource inward, by strengthening every internal system, by becoming, in the years of enforced isolation, something that the enforced isolation itself had never anticipated producing. Commander Elena Vasquez had been 11 years old when the banishment order was finalized. She had grown up in New Madrid, the largest of the underground cities that had been expanded and deepened and connected across the Martian substrate in the first decade of isolation. She had never seen a ship leave the Sol system. She had never spoken to a non-human. Her entire education had been delivered through a network that had been rebuilt during the isolation years to teach something the pre-banishment curriculum had never prioritized. Not defiance, not anger, not a mythology of human grievance. Strategy. You have to understand something about the long patience, her flight instructor had told her 20 years into the isolation, when she was old enough to begin the program that didn't officially have a name. Every other species in this galaxy has been evolving in a connected environment for hundreds of years. They've been shaped by the assumption that other civilizations exist, that trade exists, that diplomacy exists. Their instincts run toward stability, toward compromise, toward finding the arrangement that lets everyone survive. He had paused then, and she remembered the way he had looked at the star charts that lined the wall of the underground facility. Charts that showed jump routes and trade corridors and political boundaries that humans were no longer permitted to use. We didn't have that, he said. For 3 million years before we ever left our own atmosphere, we had one survival strategy. When you push us into a corner and close the door, we don't look for the compromise. We look for the door. Vasquez had been assigned to the Expanse run 2 years later, at 23, when the first generation of ships built entirely below the Martian surface were ready for deployment. Ships built without the design constraints of conventional manufacturing. Ships built specifically for a navigation problem that every other species had deemed unsolvable and therefore never tried to solve. Why do they keep making it harder? Her co-pilot Shen had asked on their 7th training run through the outer expanse, after a gravitational eddy had nearly sheared off the forward section of their hull. His voice was tight but controlled, the voice of someone who had been trained for exactly this, and was still finding it worse than the training had suggested. "They're not making it harder," Vasquez said, adjusting the dampeners by a margin that the ship's AI had flagged as outside recommended parameters. "This is just what it is. We're making ourselves better." "There's a difference. That's the whole point." The first conclave observer to make contact with a human vessel in the shattered expanse was not supposed to make contact. That was the part that Vethsarn would spend the longest time processing, because it meant the humans had been ready for contact before the conclave knew contact was happening. The observer was a Dravathi survey drone, automated, no crew, sent into the outer expanse by Ulsen under Vethsarn's unofficial instruction. It was supposed to observe and return. It had observed. It had not immediately returned because 3 minutes into its observation window, a human vessel had matched its velocity, pulled alongside it, and someone had opened a communication channel. The drone had recorded everything. "Hello," the human voice said. It was the same voice from the 6-second transmission. The same woman. Vethsarn had not expected that, and she could not have said why it disturbed her more than if it had been someone different. The drone's automated systems had not been programmed to respond to unexpected contact. It had transmitted a generic identification code, which was the default behavior. "I know what you are," the voice said. "I know you're not crude. I know whoever sent you is trying to understand what they're looking at, and I know they're probably not ready to have an official conversation yet, because an official conversation would require them to acknowledge that something their official records say is impossible is actually happening." A pause. "So this is just me talking. You can respond or not." The drone did not respond. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm commanding officer of the Patience Asterisk, which is one of 47 ships currently operating in the shattered expanse. I know how that sounds. We know what happened to your ships in here. We also know why." Another pause, and Vethsarn heard in it something that was not quite pride and not quite challenge but lived in the space between them. "We've been in here a long time." The drone's passive sensors ran their scans. Vethsarn reviewed the data, and for a long moment she simply sat with what it was showing her, because the numbers required her to revise, fundamentally and immediately, her understanding of what the isolation period had actually been. 47 vessels, all of them moving, all of them demonstrating navigational patterns that should not have been possible in the expanse's gravitational environment. Not impossible because of the physics, she realized now, but impossible because the physics required something no automated navigation system was capable of. Continuous intuitive microcorrection, responsive to conditions that could not be predicted more than seconds in advance. The kind of correction that required a pilot who had stopped thinking about the corrections and simply learned to feel them. A pilot who had been flying this specific environment for, by the drone's trajectory analysis, somewhere between 8 and 15 years. "How long," Ulsen said softly, reading the same data over her shoulder, "does it take to learn to do that?" "I don't know," Vethsarn said. "I don't think we have a comparison point." "Has any species ever attempted it?" 17 vessels attempted transit of the expanse. 17 failed. None of them attempted it more than 4 times. "How many attempts did the humans make?" She pulled the drone's sensor archive. The wreckage data embedded in the expanse, the physical debris signature of vessel failures, was extensive. She ran the mass analysis against known human hull configurations, cross-referenced the metal composition signatures from the compliance drone's archival pass, and arrived at a number that she had to check 3 times. At least 260 individual vessel failures, she said. The hull's signature distribution suggests they started small, atmospheric craft, essentially, that had been modified for vacuum and graduated to larger vessels as they developed techniques. Ulsen was quiet for a moment. They flew 260 ships into a region that kills ships, and learned something from each one. And then they built 47 that don't die. Vethsarn looked at the drone's visual feed, where the patients hung in the gravitational dark, steady and dark and waiting, next to the survey drone it had chosen to speak to. Around it, in the scanner's range, she could see 6 more vessels, different sizes, different configurations, all moving with that same fluid, unhurried certainty through conditions that had terminated every expedition any other species had ever sent. They weren't hiding in the expanse, she said, and heard her own voice arrive at the conclusion before her mind had fully processed it. They were training in it. The reinterpretation hit her like a physical thing. Everything she had assumed about the isolation years, the compliance, the containment, the comfortable conclave certainty that humanity had been successfully reduced to a regional power with no capacity to challenge the blockade, rearranged itself into a completely different picture. They had not been quiet because they were defeated. They had not been absent from the conclave's awareness because there was nothing to see. They had been quiet in the way that something becomes quiet when it has decided that the time for noise has not yet arrived. What else, she said, did we decide not to look at? The answer arrived in pieces, and each piece was worse than the previous one. The 14 colony worlds the compliance blockade had surrounded were still surrounded. The conclave's denial fields were still operational. Vethsarn knew this because the blockade was maintained by automated systems that reported to the administrative apparatus on a regular cycle, and the cycle had shown no anomalies in 31 years, and she was currently discovering that this was the most alarming fact she had ever encountered. No anomalies. A species that had been flying 260 training missions into a lethal navigational graveyard and building underground cities across the outer Sol system for 31 years had produced no anomalies in the blockade reporting system. They haven't been trying to get through the blockade, Draelmach said when she reached him again. His composure had not recovered from the footnote. They've been letting the blockade report that everything is normal because the blockade reporting what they want it to report is more useful to them than the blockade being broken, Vasquez finished. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but Draelmach heard it, and the silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the edge of something too large to immediately address. They can spoof our automated systems, he said. They can spoof our automated systems, and they have been doing so, and we have been reading the results as confirmation of containment for 31 years. Vethsarn. I know. If they can do that. I know. Then the question is not what they've been doing in the expanse. The question is what they've been doing everywhere else while we were watching the expanse. She pulled up a galactic map, stared at it for a long moment. The trade corridors, the member species systems, the relay networks, the conclave's own communication infrastructure, all of it lit in the calm blue of a system functioning normally, as confirmed by automated reporting, which she now had to consider as potentially compromised at an unknown level for an unknown duration. I need to make a report to the full council, she said. And tell them what? I don't know yet. I don't know what we're actually looking at. She paused, but I know we need to talk to her. Elena Vasquez received the official communication request with the kind of stillness that her crew had learned to read as the opposite of calm. Shen watched her from the co-pilot's seat as she read the header, conclave of 7, administrative council, priority channel, and he watched her close the notification without immediately responding. Well, he said. 31 years, she said. It was always going to happen eventually. I know, she stopped, started again. I wanted the 48. Shen understood without explanation. 48 was the fleet count. They had 47 operational in the Expanse. The 48th was 6 weeks from its final trials. 48 would have been the number she'd told herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, when she decided what asterisk ready looked like. How do you want to play this? He asked. She was quiet for a long time. The patience moved through its gravitational corridor, the automatic microcorrections happening below the level of conscious thought, her hands making adjustments she had long ago stopped tracking. Around her, the Expanse was what it always was, dark and vast and lethal, and after 15 years, familiar in the way that only something genuinely dangerous can become familiar. Honestly, she said finally, I want to play it honestly. That's not what I expected. I know, but we didn't do any of this to trick them, Shen. We did it to be real. If we start the next chapter with a deception, she shook her head. We're trying to come back to the galaxy, not conquer it. There's a difference. He considered this. They might not believe that. No, they might not. She accepted the communication request and opened the channel. And that's fine. They don't have to believe it yet. Veth Sarn had prepared for this conversation for 6 hours, which had not been enough. She had notes and precedents, and the administrative framework for conducting dialogue with a species under banishment order, and she had looked at all of it, and then set it aside because she did not think Elena Vasquez was going to respond well to administrative frameworks. When the channel opened and she saw the face, younger than she'd somehow expected, though the voice should have told her, she started with the only thing that felt honest. How much of what we thought we knew is wrong? Vasquez's expression shifted, just slightly. The thing that moved across her face wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't anger, and it took Veth Sarn a moment to identify it as something she hadn't expected: relief. Almost all of it, Vasquez said, but probably not in the way you're afraid of. What should I be afraid of? Nothing about us. We're not here to fight. We are genuinely, sincerely not here to fight. A pause. What you should be afraid of is the reason we've been out here for 15 years building a fleet the Conclave doesn't know about in a region of space the Conclave declared impassable. And the reason is not military. The reason, Vasquez said, is the core Mathis. The name hit Veth Sarn like a cold shock to the base of her spine. The core Mathis were not a member species of the Conclave. They were not a diplomatic entity. They were a threat classification, a designation the Conclave's Deep Space Monitoring Division had developed 12 years ago for a pattern of gravitational disruption events occurring in the galactic outer rim. The pattern had been flagged as possibly natural, probably natural, almost certainly natural, and filed accordingly, because the alternative required acknowledging that something was moving through the outer rim at a scale and speed that nothing the Conclave knew about could produce. You know about the core Mathis, Veth Sarn said. We've been watching them for 9 years, from the Expanse, which gives you a line of sight into the outer rim that no Conclave-controlled observation point can match. Vasquez's voice was level, not urgent. That was the thing that made it more frightening than if she'd been alarmed. Counselor, the disruption events you've been calling natural phenomena, they're not. They are directional, they are accelerating, and their current trajectory puts them on an intercept course with the Dravathi outer colonies in approximately 14 months. Veth Sarn heard Ulsen make a sound behind her. You've been monitoring them, she said slowly, from the shattered Expanse for 9 years. And you've been building a fleet. Not to fight the Conclave. We were never going to fight the Conclave. Vasquez's eyes were steady and dark. We were building something to fight the core Mathis, because the Conclave's blockade left us with the only unobstructed view of what was coming, and because—" She paused, and for the first time, something shifted behind her composure, something that was not military steadiness but something older and more human. "Because if we came back to the galaxy by saving it, nobody could say we didn't belong here." The silence that followed was not like any of the previous silences. It was not the silence of confusion or discovery or fear. It was the silence of a realization arriving fully formed and settling into place like a weight that would not be lifted. 31 years, underground cities, 260 crashed ships in a graveyard of gravitational violence, each one teaching the next crew something the last crew had died to learn. A fleet built in the dark, under a blockade that had been reporting asterisk normal because the humans had decided it was more useful to them that way. An observation post with a 9-year archive of data on a threat the Conclave had been misclassifying as weather. They had not been hiding. They had not been sulking. They had not been waiting for the Conclave to forgive them. They had been becoming. The emergency session of the Conclave was called within 8 hours of Vethsarn's initial report. She delivered the briefing herself with Draelmach beside her, and she watched the faces of the assembled representatives move through expressions she recognized in sequence from somewhere she couldn't immediately place, and then she realized. This was the same sequence. Dismissal, confusion, concern, something that wanted to refuse to be fear and was losing the argument. "The human vessel count in the expanse is confirmed at 47, she said. "Their navigational capability exceeds anything our automated systems can achieve in that environment. Their observation data on the core Mathis is 9 years comprehensive and appears to be accurate. Our own records, reanalyzed against their interpretive framework, are consistent with their conclusions. And they are offering this data and their navigational access and their fleet to the Conclave. Voluntarily." "In exchange for what?" the Kethvori representative demanded. "Old species, long memory. The one who had 31 years ago first articulated the weight of sovereignty problem." "Reinstatement," Vethsarn said. "Recognition. The lifting of the banishment order and the restoration of humanity's status as a member species. They want a bargain with a threat they invented. Our data analysis does not support the conclusion that they invented it. Our data analysis was apparently fooled by their—" "Counselor," Draelmach's voice was quiet, but the geological stillness in it stopped the Kethvori mid-sentence. "Our data analysis was not fooled by the humans. Our data analysis was produced by automated systems that were designed to confirm expected outcomes. The humans did not compromise those systems to deceive us. They compromised them to ensure that we would not interfere with what they were doing." He paused. "There is a difference. A distinction without meaningful." "The distinction," Draelmach said, "is the difference between a species that wanted to fool us into thinking they were contained, and a species that wanted to be left alone to do the work they had determined needed to be done, and was willing to spend 31 years doing it, and is now coming forward to share the result before the threat they've been preparing for arrives." He looked around the chamber. "Ask yourself, if they wanted to hurt us, what would they have done differently?" "Because I have been asking myself that question for the last 8 hours, and I cannot find a single decision they made in 31 years that would be consistent with hostile intent." The chamber was silent. "They could have broken the blockade at year 15, Vethsarn said quietly. "Their expanse navigational capability made that possible by then. They chose not to. They could have disclosed the core Mathis threat directly and demanded reinstatement on that basis at any point in the last 9 years. They chose not to." She looked at the file, still open on her console, still stamped closed. "They waited until they had a fleet capable of actually addressing the threat. Until they could come back with something real." She paused. "Because they knew we wouldn't believe them otherwise." "That's," the Kethvori started again. "That kind of patience is not something we have a model for," Draelmach said. "I know. We didn't have a model for them 31 years ago either, and the solution we chose for that problem is part of why we're here. Vasquez received the conclave's preliminary response 14 hours after her initial contact. She read it on the bridge of the patient's asterisk, with Shen beside her, with the rest of the fleet arrayed in their holding patterns across the expanse. 47 ships, almost 48. The response was not a reinstatement. It was a request for joint operational planning around the Kormathis threat, conditional on further verification of her data, with the question of permanent status to be addressed after the immediate situation was resolved. She showed it to Shen without comment. He read it. They're hedging. Of course they're hedging. They've been caught completely unprepared, they don't understand what they're looking at, and they're being asked to trust a species they voted unanimously to exile. She set the document down. Hedging is rational. Are we going to accept? She was quiet for a moment. The expanse moved around the patient's asterisk, gravitational eddies flowing past the hull in patterns she no longer consciously tracked. 15 years of this. Every mission, every crash, every revision to their navigation technique, every ship they'd lost in training, and the names of every person on those ships, which she kept in a handwritten list in the back of a notebook, because she had decided at the beginning that she was not going to let those names become data. They had not been the only ones to make decisions in 31 years. Every person in every underground city, every engineer who had designed a ship hull for conditions that had never been navigated before, every pilot who had gone into the expanse knowing the failure statistics and gone anyway, because the calculus that every other species had run on that decision had not been the calculus that humans ran on it. Yes, she said, we're going to accept. Just like that. We came back to be part of the galaxy, Shen. You don't do that by making conditions. She looked out at the dark. You do it by showing up and doing the work. The Kormathis arrived in 14 months, as predicted. What happened over the following 6 weeks is documented in the Conclave's military archives under a classification code that was created specifically for it, because no existing classification category was adequate. The human fleet, supplemented in the final operational weeks by Conclave vessels that had been rapidly retrained on expanse-derived navigation techniques that required human instructors, because no automated system could convey the intuitive component, engaged the Kormathis' advanced pattern in the outer rim, and did something the Conclave's tactical models had assessed as having a 17% probability of achieving meaningful disruption. They didn't win cleanly. The records are honest about that. The Patience itself was destroyed in the 4th engagement, which was a loss that Vasquez's official after-action report addressed in a single sentence. Vessel was expended to achieve navigational denial of primary Kormathis vector, that Vethsarn read 17 times trying to find a way to make it feel like less than it was. She couldn't. Shen had not been on board. Vasquez had ordered him to the asterisk endurance asterisk 3 hours before the engagement. He had argued. The record of that argument was 17 minutes long, and Vethsarn could only bring herself to listen to 4 of them. You can't make this decision unilaterally, Shen had said, his voice tight with something that was not anger exactly, but lived very close to it. I'm the commanding officer, Vasquez had said. Her voice was quiet, not calm, not the false calm of someone performing control, but the genuine quiet of someone who has already been through the decision in their mind and come out the other side of it. That's not the point, and you know it. Someone has to hold the vector, and I'm the best navigator in the fleet, and that's the point. A pause, long, the kind that carries everything that can't be said. Elena. Make sure they know the list, she said. The names, make sure they're in the record. He had gone to the asterisk endurance asterisk. She had held the vector. The 6-week engagement ended with the Kormathis' advance pattern disrupted and retreating, which the Conclave's tactical analysis assessed as a success, and which the human fleet's survivors assessed as something more complicated that they would be a long time working through. 29 of the 47 ships came back. 312 names were added to a list. The reinstatement vote was held 4 months later. It was also unanimous. Vethsarn was the one who lifted the asterisk close stamp from the file, which required a physical interaction, a biological signature placed on a keystone node in the original administrative record. The action was ceremonial, technically. The practical effect had already been accomplished through executive order, but ceremony matters, she had decided, and she had asked to do it herself. She pressed her hand to the node. The stamp dissolved. The file was open. Ulsen, standing beside her, the Dravathi outer colonies that Vasquez had told her about, the ones on the predicted intercept course with the Kormathis, asked her something she had not expected. "Do you think they planned all of it?" he said. "From the beginning, the Expanse, the blockade spoofing the Kormathis observation post, do you think they knew, from the moment the banishment order was issued, exactly how it was going to unfold?" Vethsarn considered this for a long time. "No," she said finally, "I don't think they planned it." "Then how?" "I think they decided one thing at the beginning, one thing only." She looked at the open file. At 31 years of a species existing in a corner while the galaxy watched the door and forgot to watch what the species was becoming. They decided they weren't going to stop. And then they woke up every day and made the next decision, and then the next, and they kept making decisions, and they kept not stopping. And after 31 years of not stopping, she paused. "That's what it looks like from the outside. It looks like a plan. But from the inside, I think it was just refusing to stop." Ulsen was quiet for a moment. "That's more frightening than a plan." "Yes," she said, "it is." She closed the terminal. Outside, somewhere in the administrative district of the Conclave's home station, a crowd had gathered to watch the formal transmission being broadcast on the public channels. The reinstatement announcement, the recognition ceremony, the first images of the human delegates walking through the council's main entrance for the first time in 31 years. She could hear it distantly, a low sound through the station walls. She thought about a 6-second transmission, a woman singing in the dark of the shattered expanse, alone, in a region of space that had killed 19 vessels, singing not as a signal, not as a message, singing because that was a thing that humans did when they were in the dark for a long time. They sang. They crashed ships into gravitational nightmares and studied what broke and built the next one better. They wrote names in notebooks. They spoofed blockade systems and stared at the outer rim for 9 years and watched something enormous moving toward the galaxy that was supposedly keeping them out. And they waited. Not because they were patient in the way that patience was understood, the philosophical, serene acceptance of delay. They waited in the way a body waits when it knows that it is not yet everything it is going to be, and continues until it is. The Conclave had called them dangerous because they wouldn't calculate properly, because their values assigned too much weight to sovereignty and not enough to survival, because they couldn't be predicted. She understood now what the analysts had misread. The humans had been calculating correctly all along. They had simply been running a calculation that no other species in the galaxy had ever attempted, one that treated stopping as the only unacceptable outcome, and arranged every other variable around that fixed point. They were not back because the Conclave had forgiven them. They were back because they had decided they would be. The sound through the station walls got louder. She didn't move. She just stood in the quiet office with the open file and the name of a ship and a list she would never read because it wasn't hers to read. And somewhere in the outer rim, in the dark where the Kormathis had retreated, the Endurance was already moving, charting the next approach, mapping the next corridor through the next killing ground, because there were 29 ships that had come back and they were not resting, because rest was not the variable they had ever prioritized. The galaxy had thought it understood what it had done when it closed the door. It had not understood, even for a moment, what kind of species it had locked inside with its own potential. Now it did. And the understanding would not leave.